Hello, dear YouTube viewers. I hope you're doing well. Okay, so let's start our video. The night had become unbearably quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but instead presses down on the chest like a weight. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of the widening gap between them. She stood by the doorway, her arms folded, a smirk tugging at her lips. Then she laughed, not with warmth, but with the sharpness of mockery. "You're not even sleeping with me," she said, her voice filled with ridicule. The words landed like blows, not because of their content alone, but because of the contempt behind them. He felt stripped of dignity, humiliated in his own home, the one place meant to shelter love and respect. Inside, something whispered to him. "I thought love protected us. I was wrong. It hadn't always been this way." He remembered when their story began, when everything felt like the start of something rare. They met in simpler times, whether in the crowded corridors of university, at the office where routine days turned into stolen glances, or through the ties of an arranged marriage that unexpectedly blossomed into laughter and companionship. Their beginnings had been filled with hope. There had been promises whispered under stars, laughter shared over ordinary meals, dreams of a future that seemed unshakable. Back then, her smile was a comfort, her words a reassurance. But somewhere along the line, those smiles hardened into weapons. Those words became daggers. The love they built now stood on a fragile edge, and the seeds of betrayal, though still hidden, had already been planted. As days turned into months, the cracks began to show. She grew distant, her attention consumed by her phone, her friends, and endless hours scrolling through social media. He noticed how their conversations became shorter, how her laughter was reserved for someone or something beyond the walls of their home. The dinners they once enjoyed together turned into cold meals eaten in silence. Every attempt he made to bridge the distance was brushed aside, as though his presence had become an inconvenience. Arguments followed, small at first, but growing sharper, his need for intimacy and connection clashing against her indifference. He pleaded for closeness, but she dismissed it with irritation. He began to feel invisible, unvalued, as if his very existence no longer mattered to her. The realization settled heavy on him. I was becoming a stranger in my own house. The home that once carried their love now echoed with isolation. The woman he thought would stand beside him forever now seemed like a shadow he couldn't reach. The silence between them was no longer just the absence of words. It was the presence of everything broken. Her laughter came again, sharp and merciless, cutting through the room like glass shattering against stone. He had heard it before, but tonight it carried a weight that left him unable to breathe. She looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You're not even man enough to share a bed." The words didn't just echo in the air. They burned into his chest, searing his pride, his dignity, his sense of worth. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Inside, his mind churned with shame, humiliation wrapping itself around him like chains. How did we come to this? He thought. When did her laughter become a weapon instead of comfort? That night, as she turned away, he lay awake in the dark, realizing that something inside him had shifted. A seed had been planted. It was small but steady, whispering, "You cannot live like this forever." The days that followed only deepened the wound. She spent more time glued to her phone than with him, smiling at texts that were never shared, retreating into private corners for hushed calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Suspicion took root, gnawing at his sanity. He had never been the type to spy, but one night, desperation overpowered restraint. He picked up her phone while she slept, his heart pounding so hard he feared it would wake her. What he found wasn't a confession, but it was enough to feed the fire. Messages from late at night, playful, suggestive in tone, names saved under meaningless contacts. Nothing outright damning, yet enough to make his blood run cold. He put the phone down, his hands trembling. Betrayal didn't need confirmation anymore. It lived in the secrecy, the half-truths, the sudden distance that had turned their marriage into a stage play where he was nothing more than a background character. Every notification on her phone felt like a dagger. He thought, each vibration a reminder that someone else was receiving the warmth she had denied him. But despite the storm brewing inside him, he wasn't ready to surrender. Love, or perhaps habit, pushed him to try again. He suggested counseling, hoping a professional voice could bridge the chasm. She scoffed, rolling her eyes. We don't need a stranger to tell us what we already know. He tried planning dinner dates, quiet nights where they could talk. She dismissed them with excuses, too tired, too busy, not interested. Finally, he confronted her directly, his voice raw with desperation. We can't go on like this. Don't you see we're falling apart? Her response stung more than silence. She laughed lightly, dismissively, and said, Stop acting like a child. This isn't a movie. People don't fix everything over candlelight dinners. With those words, his last thread of hope began to unravel. He saw in her eyes not just disinterest, but contempt. He was no longer a partner, no longer someone she respected. He was an inconvenience. Each rejection chipped away at him. His dignity eroded piece by piece, like a cliff crumbling into the sea. He withdrew into himself, carrying the weight of a marriage that had already died but refused to be buried. He stopped trying to explain his feelings, stopped asking for her time. Silence became his only defense, though even that offered no peace. Then came the night that broke him completely. Another argument, another cruel laugh tossed in his direction like a knife. She didn't even notice the way he froze, the way his jaw clenched, as if holding back something final. When she walked away, still muttering under her breath, he sat alone, staring at the empty glass in his hand. For the first time, the thought of leaving felt less like a threat and more like salvation. He opened his journal, a place that had become his silent confidant, and wrote with steady, deliberate strokes, Tomorrow, I'll say the words that will change everything. He stared at the sentence for a long time, letting its weight sink in. Fear coursed through him, fear of the unknown, of breaking a life they had built together. But beneath the fear, there was something else, relief. Relief that he had finally chosen himself after years of choosing her. That night, as he closed the journal and lay in bed beside a woman who had long stopped seeing him, he felt the storm raging inside. Fear and relief collided, hope and despair tangled together. But through the chaos, one truth remained unshaken. Enough was enough. The house was unusually quiet that evening. The television was off, the hum of appliances seemed distant, and the air between them carried a heaviness that neither of them wanted to touch. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his breathing calm but deliberate. She walked in, her phone in hand, her expression detached, as though the man in front of her was no different than the furniture around them. For a moment, he simply watched her, memorizing the face he had once adored. Then, in a voice steady and unshaken, he said the words he had rehearsed 100 times in his mind. I want a divorce. The sound of his voice, so certain, so final, shattered the silence. Her body stiffened. The phone slipped from her hand, landing with a soft thud on the couch. For years, she had met his words with laughter, sarcasm, or disdain, but this time her mask cracked. Her eyes widened, and then, to his astonishment, tears began to roll down her cheeks. The same woman who had mocked him, who had ridiculed his need for closeness, was now breaking apart before his eyes. There was a cruel irony in it. She had laughed at his pain, but now she was undone by his strength. Don't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling as if the ground beneath her had vanished. She moved closer, her tears flowing freely. "Please, we can fix it. I didn't mean those things. You know I didn't." He remained silent, his face unreadable. Inside, however, a storm raged. Part of him wanted to reach out, to comfort her the way he once would have without hesitation. But another part, stronger now, remembered the nights of humiliation, the sting of her laughter, the coldness that had turned his home into a prison. He thought of every insult, every dismissive glance, every moment she had chosen pride over love. His silence became his shield, protecting what little remained of his dignity. She collapsed into a chair across from him, sobbing into her hands. "Please listen to me," she begged. "I don't want to lose you. I'll change. I'll do better. Just give me another chance." His gaze lingered on her, but his mind drifted elsewhere. He saw flashes of their past, her mocking smile, the way she had thrown his vulnerability back at him, the cold rejection of his attempts to save them. Then, like a cruel split screen, he saw her now, broken and desperate, her tears staining her cheeks. The contrast was unbearable. Where were these tears when I needed love? He thought. Where was this desperation when I was begging for her to see me? The image of a broken glass came to him. No matter how carefully one tried, the shards could never be fitted together without leaving sharp edges, without scars. That was their marriage now. A shattered vessel that could no longer hold what it once promised. Then came the moment that changed everything. Through her sobs, she whispered something that made his blood run cold. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just needed someone to talk to. It wasn't serious, I swear." He looked at her sharply, the weight of her words sinking in. She avoided his eyes, her guilt written plainly across her face. An emotional affair, perhaps more. Suddenly, the late-night messages, the hidden phone calls, the secrecy, all of it snapped into place like pieces of a puzzle he had tried to ignore. "Who was it?" he asked quietly. Her lips trembled. She shook her head, refusing to speak. That silence was enough. He didn't need every detail. The truth had already revealed itself. Betrayal wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was fact. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. He leaned back, feeling both the sting of confirmation and an odd sense of release. The weight he had carried for so long was finally justified. He hadn't been paranoid. He hadn't imagined the distance. She had been giving away pieces of herself to someone else while he was still fighting to keep them whole. She reached for his hand, her touch trembling. "It didn't mean anything," she cried. "It was a mistake. Please believe me. We can move past this." He withdrew his hand, his face calm but resolute. For the first time in years, he felt stronger than her tears, stronger than the guilt she tried to weave around him. The irony cut deep. When he had begged for love, she had offered laughter. Now that he demanded freedom, she offered tears. But he no longer needed her sorrow. In his heart, a final truth echoed. Some wounds can heal, but betrayal writes its scars in ink that never fades. The news of his decision did not stay between them for long. Families always have a way of finding out, whispers spreading faster than truth itself. Within days, her relatives came knocking, faces painted with concern but voices heavy with accusation. They sat across from him in the living room, their tone shifting between pleading and scolding. "You can't just walk away like this," her uncle said firmly. "Marriage is sacred. Think of the children. Think of the family honor." Her mother, with tears in her eyes, added, "She made mistakes, yes, but who doesn't? Don't throw everything away for pride." His own relatives weren't much different. Friends who once praised him for being a good husband now urged him to bend, to compromise, to carry the burden silently as if endurance was proof of manhood. The pressure was suffocating, their words wrapping around him like ropes trying to pull him back into chains he had just broken. But he stood firm, his voice steady. Respect is the foundation. Without it, nothing remains. The room fell silent at that declaration. He wasn't speaking only to them, he was reminding himself as well. His wife, seeing that persuasion from others was not enough, began her own transformation. The sharpness in her voice softened. The arrogance that once defined her melted into tears and trembling words. "I was wrong," she whispered late at night, clutching his arm. "I'll change. I'll be better. Please don't leave me." Her anger was gone, replaced by regret, so raw it almost fooled him. She began cooking his favorite meals again, leaving notes by his bedside, trying to recreate the tenderness she had buried for years. To anyone else, it might have looked like a miracle of repentance, but to him, it felt like desperation born not of love but of fear of losing the life she had taken for granted. He watched her closely, torn between the past and the present. She seemed so small now, so unlike the woman who had once wielded laughter like a blade. He couldn't help but wonder, was her sorrow real, or was it just another performance to hold on to comfort and security? The audience of his life, their families, their friends, even his own aching heart, leaned forward, wondering if forgiveness would rise from the ashes. But deep inside, doubt lingered. A tree once uprooted cannot simply be replanted, as if nothing happened. In search of clarity, he withdrew from the noise of others and sought the quiet of memory. He walked past the cafe where they had shared their first coffee, recalling how her laughter then was genuine, filled with promise rather than cruelty. He stood before the park bench where he had once planned their future, tracing the ghost of a younger man who believed love was enough. At home, he opened their wedding album, the photographs staring back with smiles so bright they seemed like strangers. Each memory carried both sweetness and pain, reminders of what was and what could never be again. As he closed the album, a heavy truth settled over him. Divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the unraveling of a history, a home, a shared identity. It meant saying goodbye not only to her, but to the man he had been with her. And yet, even as grief pressed down on him, he felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. For the first time in years, he could breathe without chains. Some endings, he thought, staring at the fading sunset outside his window, are the only way to find peace. The final night was quiet, almost deceptively so. The walls of the house stood heavy with memories, laughter that had long since soured, promises that had dissolved into dust. He sat in the living room with his suitcase by his side, the sound of the zipper echoing like a closing chapter. His wife stood near the doorway, her eyes red from endless crying. She whispered his name, reaching out as if the sound alone might tether him back to her. But he had already made his choice. He rose, steady and calm, carrying not only the weight of his belongings but the fragments of his dignity. "It's over," he said softly, not with anger, but with the kind of certainty that comes from surviving countless storms. Her tears flowed again, desperate, pleading, but he did not falter. He remembered her laughter, the cruel kind that belittled him, stripped him of worth. Those wounds had healed into scars, and scars remind us not to touch the same fire twice. He walked past her, the suitcase wheels rolling across the floor like a drumbeat announcing his freedom. She sobbed behind him, begging for another chance, but the sound only grew faint as he reached the door. He paused for one last moment, not to turn back, but to breathe in the finality of it all. Her tears fell, he thought, but they could not wash away the years of betrayal. With a steady hand, he opened the door. The night air met him like an embrace, cool and cleansing. He stepped outside, pulling the suitcase behind him, and closed the door with a quiet click that carried the weight of finality. For her, it was an ending. For him, it was a beginning. The street was still, but in the distance, the first signs of dawn began to stretch across the horizon. The faint glow of sunrise painted the sky, a reminder that even after the darkest nights, light returns. He stood for a moment, breathing it in before walking forward into the unknown. He was scarred, yes, but free. And in that freedom came the truth he had long avoided. Love without respect is cruelty, and sometimes the bravest choice is to walk away. Betrayal was not the end of his life. It was the start of his self-respect, the beginning of a chapter he would write on his own terms. Thanks for watching. For more videos, please subscribe. Our channel, Awesome Visual Story.